All right, welcome everybody. This is the third presentation for today. Very pleased to introduce Daniel Mulkenton, who will be walking us through the experience from InfoRun for scaling BigBlueButton for schools in a lockdown from scratch. So as a brief bio, Daniel is an open source contributor to more than 20 years, working on various projects, mostly as a developer. In addition, he's always been a system admin at heart, and at InfoRun, he has worked with a team that runs a huge scale BigBlueButton cluster and contributed various patches. He's also involved in the packaging efforts as well. Daniel, over to you. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Fred. I'm gonna walk you through that interesting time that Fred already announced. And I'll be shortly introducing myself and InfoRun. I think Fred has mostly done that. I'll go over all the challenges that we had that are multifold in type. It's technical, it's social, it's also completely unexpected external factors. And of course, I'm gonna talk about how we're going to go from here. Again, Fred said most of the things. I'm an active open source developer since the early 2000s. I've lately adopted video and video processing with open source tools as one of my hobbies. I'm a sysadmin at heart, and I've become an author of a developer's book on Qt, more or less by accident. But that's a story for another day. And I live in Berlin, Germany. InfoRun. This is actually an interesting story. The initial idea was to create a hosting cooperative, for the Germans, it's Genossenschaft. And the basic idea was, I've got some of these rare IP spaces lying around, and let's do good things with it. And let's make sure it doesn't go, it's not sold for big money, but it's going to be put to good use. And later that year, at the CCC, yearly CCC Congress, Cyber for Edu was founded, which is basically designed to educate schools, school administrations, teachers, and the like about the possibilities and also the challenges, and try to solve that when it comes to teaching online. And almost, it's almost foreshadowing, because just a few months later, the pandemic hit, and there were first step at an educational event, and there's just no way to do this. And we thought, okay, this may be a good way or a good opportunity to test this BigBlueButton thing that we wanted to offer to schools. And we quickly realized, okay, we can't do this on a single machine, and we can't do this by hand. So how do we do this? And we quickly settled for Ansible, because that's what we were using previously. Noemis, thankfully, has done a lot of work in that regard. So we picked up on the role that Noemis wrote. However, then we quickly also needed to sign contracts, and Genossenschaftsgesetz basically says that you have to go through an audit that can take up to 6 months, which we didn't have. So instead, we went for a limited liability company as a surrogate construct. And currently we are running a large BigBlueButton cluster serving public schools. So the offer is there for all public schools in Berlin through the Senate of Berlin, a lot of schools in Bavaria through through a partner of ours, and also various schools in other states that are actually using our BigBlueButton cluster. Also, the Senate of Berlin has contracted us to help them revamping their Moodle instance, which is called Lernraum Berlin. And we already successfully introduced single sign-on with Keycloak and the GDPR compliant retention policy that was requested by the data protection officer. We're also setting up our own data center at that point. Why? We'll go into that later. And what is very important to us is that everything we do or we host is and has to be open source software. So how did we get to BigBlueButton? It was fairly simple. Cyber4Edu tried Jitsi, had their own Jitsi instance, and it became pretty apparent that that would not scale. So BBB offered a lot that we knew was needed. So that's what we went with. So I was mentioning that we were bootstrapping BigBlueButton. So, but how do you go about something like that? And we didn't have any hardware that we owned. Obviously, we did not want to go to the obvious hyperscalers for GDPR reasons, but also for reasons that we found they weren't actually that cheap. So we found a pretty reasonable hoster and started out with a couple of VMs that quickly escalated to a few hundred VMs. I think 200 at the peaks. Those were Intel machines, 8 dedicated cores. We managed to host around 120 users on average, and this is really only an estimate, because it's really hard to tell how many users have a satisfactory experience. And mostly, this is mostly due to Currento, and we'll talk about that in a second. Also, we had a companion VM for Turn. We used to use CodeTurn. We switched to Eternal, which worked better for us in general. And the reason why we were so happy with VMs for so long as we were is because it was really fast ramp up and maintenance experience. However, it turned out to be rather expensive. And so it was time when we felt like we understood the process and we were comfortable with it to reevaluate alternatives. And those alternatives came in the form of 100 physical servers, 12-core Ryzen machines. And with BBB 2.2, we realized that 150 users are realistic again. I'll go into detail as to why that is. And that was way below potential. And you probably heard this in the other talks. And then we went into optimization. We reduced update rates in the BBB HTML5 client. We rolled out the packages that Daniel from TU Chemnitz did. And we also productized 2.3 early. And that meant we had this bottleneck that the single-threaded or single process HTML5 host out of the way. But predicting the quality of service that we provide with that remains a difficult job. And that is because, and I've brought you a Grafana screenshot here. And the interesting part is this is not from the pandemic. This is a recent screenshot, but you'll realize I've removed the scale because, ironically, the scale doesn't really matter here, because what you're seeing is the amount of sessions that is in yellow, and the green line is the amount of participants. And what you can see is that there's lots and lots of participants per session. So the session remain rather static, but the amount of participants joining jumps up, and that is because classes are a bit different than what you would see, for instance, in typical university usage. And there's like 20 to 30, maybe sometimes more than 30 students in it. And most of them, and I'll jump there, let me see. Yeah, there we go, are supposed to show that they're there, which is especially popular with primary school teachers. And if you attended the first session today, you will have heard that this is like handling is difficult for primary school students, but because they don't really know who's there, they want to make really sure that that all hands are on board. So they ask everyone to enable their camera. And well, behavior is quadratic. So if you have like 30 people starting their camera, that was just, or especially when going into and returning to breakout rooms simultaneously, which is Corentus bottleneck, simultaneous connection handling. That was just impossible with 2.2. With 2.3, we saw an improvement, but nothing that would really let us sleep well at that point. But it works a lot better. And here's a challenge that is entirely unrelated to BigBlueButton, really, but also an interesting aspect. In March, we received an email from our hoster that we explicitly asked if this type of traffic was fine with them. And they basically said, well, I'm afraid you busted our calculations. And the background here is that Deutsche Telekom really applies pressure to both the customers and their customers' target providers to pay them money for the traffic. So obviously our hoster had to pay Telecom per megabit that we made extra to whatever they negotiated with Deutsche Telekom. Megabit per second, that is. And that obviously got very expensive for them, especially because we were not the only ones to run BigBlueButton at that specific hoster. And as a consequence, they said, you can stay, but we're going to void all your included traffic from now on. So 0 included traffic. And you'll have to pay a special price per gigabyte that is significantly beyond what we would normally let people pay. And well, if they aren't mean, they're also incompetent ISPs. And Vodafone really was one of them. There's just no other way to say it. They rolled out a firmware update for their cable customers that broke BigBlueButton, probably also other applications that use WebRTC, but specifically BigBlueButton. And the only workarounds that they gave out was to disable hardware offload, which of course people were not happy about because it would jitter like hell, so it wouldn't really help. And it would also significantly reduce the bandwidth that they sold. So if you sell a gigabit and suddenly there's only less than 100 megabit left, then of course your customers are not going to be very happy. At the same time, the other proposal was that you could either request a downgrade or an upgrade, which depending on the hotline personnel that you met meant writing an email or even writing a letter. So that was quite absurd and caused a huge support load. And luckily we weren't alone, so shared pain is less pain, but it was still very painful. And it was good that we always had information flowing within the German BigBlueButton community. The next challenge is teachers and technology, which is of course a stereotype because these days most teachers are as old as I am, even younger, so they know their way around digital things, but at the same time some don't. And surprisingly, they really need a dial-in and quick. So I rang up on a friend of mine and I was like, yeah, I need a dial-up solution. Can we sit down and hack something? And he was like, is it FreeSwitch? Yes, it's FreeSwitch. And I know you know FreeSwitch. And he was like, okay. So we came up with something that is now a dedicated Ansible role. Basically what it does is take a zip trunk and distribute it depending on the node number. So we assign each node a number. So it's node number.bbb.info.run. Well, then the zip gateway will forward the call to the respective node, which will then take the call and join it to the respective meeting. We had to introduce anonymous call blocking because obviously it's very tempting to just give out the number and let someone call anonymously and disrupt the meeting. We haven't found a good solution to only show the number to moderators in some meetings, but for other meetings, everyone should see it. So that's something that's actually worth improving on that I didn't mention in the things worth improving on. So bear that in mind. The other thing that people had a problem with, it's non-obvious and also a real problem that the first person to join in a room cannot do so by phone, assuming that, for instance, the teacher does have difficulties with their internal microphone. They may want to call in via telephone, and that didn't work. We found a workaround that is now part of the ABBA role, which is basically the successor of the anonymous Ansible role. And maybe we find a way to cleanly integrate that into BigBlueButton upstream. The other challenges were security related. Of course, the obvious advantage of open source is that you can actually do your due diligence and check the software for problems. And one of the findings that we had was that system depermissions were off, meaning that the system service files belonged to not to root but to the service user, which meant that if you managed to execute code in as a service user, you had an implicit privilege escalation. We reported that responsibly. Others did as well. In addition, we mitigated that via Ansible in the meanwhile. Unfortunately, we saw regressions within the 2.2 area, and yeah, we need a way to make sure that is not happening again. But we'll talk about packaging later. FreeSwitch was shipped with basically a full configuration with things that we deemed unsafe. So we trimmed it down and hardened FreeSwitch with UpArmor. And also we looked at other service files and applied security measures. We also saw the problem that some BBB nodes would suddenly fail to work. And one of the way that manifested in was a failing echo test. So how do you deal with that? We wrote a functional test with Selenium that would basically export the status of the echo test working or not working and export it to Prometheus, and do so for all the hosts in the cluster periodically. On failure, the node gets flagged as failed, and then it's still a manual intervention because we are not, obviously it's a bit hard to always assume that a single failure or two is immediately a permanent failure. But what we do is remove it from the cluster so it can drain meetings, reboot the machine, and rejoin the node to the cluster. And actually, that exporter, just like everything else I noted, is open source, and you can use it for your own cluster if you so like. More challenges was that as we looked at SQLite, we found it had no concept of multiple tenants, and sharing the secret for obvious reasons is a no-go. But we did have multiple tenants. For instance, we had Lerner Berlin as a tenant. We had another company that we're cooperating with as a tenant. And we had a bunch of small instances like Cyber for EU. And obviously we couldn't share a secret, which meant we didn't really have one cluster. We effectively had like 3 clusters at least at a time. And obviously that would mean that we needed some headroom for each cluster, which meant the entire headroom was quite large, and therefore we had way too much machines. And the pressure was rising, obviously. More people were using the cluster. So we needed a solution, enter B3 Scale. B3 Scale is our multi-tenancy BBB scaler, written in Go. Its development was supported through the Prototype Fund, which is an initiative of the German Open Knowledge Foundation, and is funded by the Ministry of Research and Education. It allows for really fast operations. So all the operation, removing a node, adding a node, et cetera, is really, really fast. It has 2 basic concepts, which is front ends, which is different tenants, and the usual backends that you all know from SQLite. It also knows about tags. I'll go into that. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. And we have an agent process called B3 Scale Node-D, which actually knows the load and the state of an agent. So we don't have to second guess ourselves. We actually know what's going on a given node. And it also has implicit Prometheus monitoring support, which is also nice. And we'll also see what that means. So why would we need tags? The most interesting use cases were BBB 2.3. So when we introduced BBB 2.3, we actually had the possibility to switch over friendly users earlier than everyone else, that we had to inform first and give them a preview of the features that were about to come. So we could gradually switch over nodes by the bunch, and really only give those that were ready for 2.3 access to 2.3, and everyone else could continue with 2.2 as they were used to. We could even assign them betas if we wanted to. We didn't though. Currently, we have an HTTP API in the making, which is really interesting for a lot of reasons. We do not use the recording feature of BigBlueButton, and one huge problem with others adapting B3 Scale was that they said, okay, we need support for recording. So that's also something that's coming up. And we have experimental support for hiding the node names, because a lot of people complained that, hey, I have to rejoin Or if I join the next day, then the room is on another machine and I have to assign permissions. I have to allow my browser to access phone and camera again. So that's quite annoying. So we have experimental support for hiding all the machines behind a coherent URL that can actually also be depending on the tenant using it. So not only a generic name like BB Infrarun, but like conference.tenant.org or whatever. It does have some shortcomings in BBB itself. So it breaks with multiple breakout rooms and other things. But in general, we would like to rule out those problems and make that a proper feature that we feel confident supporting. So if you would like to talk about that, you're welcome. So this is B3 scale at work. So you can see this is different tenants throughout the day and how they're using this. So we can also use this for capacity planning. So you can see, for instance, that here there is a tenant that obviously uses capacity throughout the day. This tenant has a peak in the morning. And so this helps planning, and this also helps debugging with different tenants, which is really nice. Another thing that is really, really great is the way we were able to collaborate. There were a lot of things that were extremely quick to land in an upstream version. And one of them was like, we figured the waiting page wasn't translated. And that was very confusing. So we came up, or I came up with a really simple way to add translations to the waiting page, which is outside the usual translation ecosystems for technical reasons. And so I typed up a draft, and basically if first version was in within a few days, and it was then shipped. And so this is completely awesome. Also, people asked for an explicit confirmation that makes people understand that everything they just did, again, there is no recording in our case, will be gone if you do not explicitly save it, if you end a specific room. And so I proposed something, and I didn't even get around to finish that patch. And someone thankfully picked up from there, finished it, and it ended up just in the next version. And it was completely awesome. And finally, of course, and I did mention that in the beginning, the community, especially the BigBlueButton DE matrix channel people, are just immensely helpful. They find things, they're smart, and it's just, it would have been a completely different game without them. I'll get to the shout outs later, but I'll just leave that here for the moment. Okay, so then we come to the things to improve. Packaging, this is something that Fred has allowed a couple of people to peek into. We've already picked up on it, but this is something that's hopefully going to improve, and I'm confident we'll be seeing improvements there. The Grento situation, Fred just told me that there is going to be a talk about this tomorrow, so you really don't want to miss that, because whatever solves the Grento problem is something that solves a lot of problems for all of us. Then finally, predictable rooms that are not only predictable in URL, but also all other aspects of it are predictable, like the dial-in number, etc. That will be immensely helpful. Right now, this only really becomes the thing on first join. We would really like for that to change, so you can really schedule meetings in a reliable way, even on a cluster. And it would be immensely helpful to be able to migrate running sessions. And I know this isn't easy, and it's a multi-part story, So yeah, that's that. Then it would be really, really great if the whiteboard could be exported, especially if it could be exported back to PDF or even Office files. And iOS support. The problem really is schools are buying iOS hardware as much as I hate it, but apparently MDM on iOS is deemed so superior that well, we'll have to deal with it. And so yeah, the fact that Safari is particularly limiting iOS access to yeah, sharing and stuff probably necessitates a separate app, at least on iOS. So no browser-only experience. And I think that would immensely help the acceptance of BigBlueButton. Lessons learned. Wrapping up here, always audit your software. I've said that it's the strength of open source, so make use of it. Anticipate external factors. We knew that telecom was bad, but I mean, we asked, and it was still a problem. We did not anticipate the massive Vodafone fuck up, and yeah, virtualization is something that should be avoided at this point, as long as BigBlueButton is not using a service-oriented architecture or design. It's best to just run it on bare metal hardware. And also understand exactly how your use case is different from the others. Like in our case, we thought, okay, great. We just take Greenlight, we take Scalite, and there's our cluster. But we didn't realize that with GDPR, multiple tenants, and custom-hosted front ends, that would actually bring us in a situation where the single key constraint is a problem for us. And so that's where B3 Scale came really convenient. And finally, open source really works. Up. Whoop. I'm sorry. Yeah. And just to give a short lookout on what's up for InfoRun, we are actually now in the process of becoming a legitimate co-op, Genossenschaft. Paperwork is being done, and we are about to offer a complete open source-based solution for schools that extends beyond BigBlueButton. It also means identity management with Keycloak, Moodle, Nextcloud, metrics for chat, WordPress, if school homepages need to be hosted, etc., etc., etc. In a way, in a package that works across schools, but still keeps schools separate to be GDPR compliant. And well, now that I've done my fair share of advertisement, let me do a final round of shout outs. Thank you to Blindside and the BBB community. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Noemis, for the invaluable Ansible role. Thank you for SenseCall, which have been doing all this voluntarily, and they've created amazing tools, and they've accumulated amazing knowledge that I think we all profited from. Thank you to Daniel Schreiber from TU Chemnitz, who took the effort of packaging the improved HTML5 packages. Thank you to Ebba for hosting the Ansible role. Thank you to Brutal Bertie for backporting the patches that we did to the Ebba repo after the Ebba repo forked off. And thanks to Lucas for digging into security-related issues. And with that, I would get to your questions.
Thanks, Daniel. That was great. For folks who have questions, please type them in the chat. And I think Daniel and I will be scrolling up in the chat here for a little bit to try to pull out your questions. Leon, I'll just mention the actual BigBlueButton WordPress plugin. It is not maintained right now. We had done a lot of work on it in the past. Someone else is going to need to step up and maintain it. Can't do everything, but we would love to see a WordPress developer.
Yeah, we are not using, so WordPress is not something that we want to integrate BigBlueButton into, but the idea is that mostly schools will use that through the learning management system, which is through Moodle. And WordPress is really just a way to maintain like a school homepage. We know that a couple of schools basically now need a new hoster for like their everyday needs. Because of political changes in some states, or one state in particular. So that's why we basically wrap the whole package, but it doesn't necessarily mean any integration of BigBlueButton in that area.
Terry's question, Daniel, can you adapt the number of BigBlueButton backends to the participant's number?
Sorry?
Just Terry had asked a question, can you adapt the number of BigBlueButton backends to the participant's number?
If you mean in terms of auto scale, no, but there are all the informations that would allow you to do so. Like if you build an autoscaler out of this, obviously, because you can't migrate sessions, that feature is not as valuable as it seems. But yes, like all the metrics are there, so you could, in theory, autoscale it. It's just not done by default.
Daniel, while other people are typing in questions, I think you have been working with open source for 20 years. Were you looking for an open source solution when you started looking around, or the fact that BigBlue? Yes, okay.
Yes, definitely. There was just I mean, for us, it was a matter of like our core, basically. I'll just call it core because that's what we want to be and what we're going to be going forward. Comprises mostly of people that have a background in open source, in the networking community, like in networking as in TCP/IP and autonomous systems, and also development, which is also mostly open source based and related. So yeah. This was something that we took out. Like, it's always easy to take a product and run with it, and then you lose all the benefits of open source contribution, as you can probably testify.
Yes.
And again, like if you keep your proprietary solutions, you're also doomed to maintain them. So the idea is to upstream as much as possible to the degree that seems useful. Like, yeah. I'm not going to cram special features that I did because I needed it as a sort of a hack and burden everyone with it. But if enough people find it useful, or I think I can, or we think we can make it a general feature, then of course we're going to upstream it.
And I think
I'd like to emphasize, for selfish reasons.
Yeah, I like to emphasize for people that is actually one of the reasons why you guys, are presenting, and the fact that you had not only built upon, but we're really trying to contribute back.
Yes.
This is sort of the prototype for other groups as well, that the more you contribute, the more you get. And there's been comments here in the chat, like a lot of groups were kind of solving similar problems and had faced similar problems. So it's certainly welcome when somebody points out an issue in the documentation or an issue in the product and maybe sends a pull request to help improve it. you actually, it may not be clear, but that's really a big help because a lot of things are distributed now and pieces of the product can be worked on independently, a lot more than they were recently. And it frees up the core developers' time to sort of dive into the deeper, harder problems to solve. And it's very much appreciated. We've got 5 minutes left, and then we're going to stop the recording. But of course, Daniel, you are more than welcome to stay in the session and just continue to collaborate with others here. But just for the time, we will be switching the live stream over in about 5 minutes. The one thing that I think I'm going to pick up on, one thing that you had actually built up something to do the echo test, and this was Selenium. So maybe could you expand on that a moment? Did you like run Chrome with a virtual frame buffer and just have it go into a session and figure out whether it did a yay or nay?
Yeah. So actually, it's not Chrome in a virtual machine. We took one of the dedicated 12-core machines, set it aside, and that is basically the machine that continuously runs these tests. So yes, it's very resource intensive, but at the same time, it's worth the effort. And as to the root cause why the nodes failed the echo test, it's different. It's different reasons. In the early times, it was mostly coturn causing us headaches. Then it was a bug in the new turn server that also caused us headaches. And these days, we still see random failures sometimes, and we try to debug them on an individual basis. But every time something pans out that seems to be an upstream bug, we file it for obvious reasons. Solving the problem with DTAG. No, obviously we rented space in a given data center. The solution is to make contracts with others that do high traffic volumes with DTAG and that are actually interested in supporting projects like us. Yeah, we are also trying to talk to DTAG. So let's see how that pans out. But it was really difficult to basically have the trigger on the head and be told like, okay, you accept our terms, or you will be gone with all your hosted machines. So that was really problematic. And yes, I'm happy to talk about that after we're done. One of the things we see recently, I was just reminded in terms of failing echo test is a failing MongoDB. And I think that's been experienced by others as well in 2.3.
Daniel, very thankful for the talk. This was very pragmatic and touched on a lot of points that anyone who is administrating BigBlueButton at scale could relate to. And hopefully some of them out there may actually reach out to you to sort of leverage a bit. And as always, we encourage people to post to our forums. There's lots of people out there, and anything that's posted will get searched by the index, the search engine, so you can share with others. I want to thank you, Daniel, for the presentation. I'm going to stop the recording now. It was really good, Daniel. Thank you.